second segment is on entrepreneurship, and our speakers are Oriana Bandiera, professor of economics at LSE. She studied a lot on how monetary and non-monetary incentives affect behavior. And then Markus Goldstein, he's at the World Bank in the Africa region. He's the practice leader. He's well known for the Gender Innovation Lab, to all us gender practitioners in the bank, where they help teams in integrating impact evaluations in operations, and also for his contribution to the blog, Development Impact, that can discuss in more plain, popular terms a lot of the meaning of this impact evaluation. So we'll start. We talk about entrepreneurship. There are 1.5 billion entrepreneurs in the developing world. That's probably not surprising, but it's huge. And obviously, this is a continuum of entrepreneurship that goes from very low, small micro activities, family enterprises, to more accomplished enterprises, SMEs, etc. The paper that Oriana wrote, which is on capital skills and economic lives of the poor, recent evidence from field experiments, including some of her own, looks at a specific segment of this continuum, the very poor women. And she finds some surprising results. We would think we should support these entrepreneurs, but then these are very poor women, and say, well, perhaps they could be better off in wage employment, that they are forced to be entrepreneurs. Actually, she finds pretty big impacts. So can you tell us a little bit about what you find?
Sure. So just to provide some context, this is BRAC's Targeting the Ultra-Poor program, whereby the poorest women in the poorest regions of rural Bangladesh are offered a menu of assets with complementary training. In practice, it ends up being a livestock program because everybody in the sample chooses a combination of cows or other animals. And what BRAC does is that it gives this very large asset compared to the average wealth of the woman in the sample. The value of the asset is 10 times as much. And it also gives very intense training for 2 years. So it's a lot of hand-holding. So I agree with you that it's quite surprising that we can show that the poorest women who have no skills and no assets can actually learn how to use both. But it's also true that the counterfactual is not secure wage labor. What they were doing was very insecure occupation. They were either rural laborers or maids, and also the occupation of maid is very regular. So at baseline, these women were working about 90 days, between 90 and 120 days a year. And when they were working very long days. So it was very regular. When job was available, they were working 12 hours a day, but for most of the year, they had nothing to do. And indeed, one of the main effects that we find is that their labor supply increases a lot, increases by about 20% after 4 years. So it is true that the program was a success, but it's also a success compared to what they were doing otherwise, which was not particularly stable and secure. So I know of no evaluation that compares wage labor, secure wage labor, to small-scale entrepreneurship. And I would need to have an evaluation like that to answer your question.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And actually, for me, what is very interesting about this piece is also that this is sort of like a social safety net with a spring. It's sort of like a welfare to work program, in a sense. So it could also be seen from this other perspective of a twist on the social safety net aspect. I don't know if...
Well, for 2 years, I agree with you. Then we follow these women for another 2 years. So we now have results after 4 years. And after the first 2 years, BRAC leaves. And they are able and entitled to do whatever they like with the asset. So they are left with an asset which is worth 10 times their wealth. It's quite surprising that they keep to it. After 4 years, all the women in the program still keep the cow instead of selling it and consuming the proceeds. It's a massive wealth shock. And the labor supply is still higher. And actually, we find that after 4 years, the productivity has gone up. And also, we see them on an upward trajectory where they start accumulating assets like land, and their happiness, self-reported admittedly, goes up as well. So I think it was more of a welfare to work the first 2 years because BRAC was literally holding their hands. But after 4 years, it's really an entrepreneurship program.
We'll come to you, Marcus. Marcus contributed with 2 papers to this report. He wrote one, You Can't Eat Cotton, Evidence on Crop Portfolios and Gender from Benin. And the second paper is Breaking the Metal Ceiling, Female Entrepreneurs Who Succeed in Male-Dominated Sectors in Uganda. And what is interesting about these 2 studies is that they both look at specific groups of women. They are not just looking at women on average, let's say, but they look at women that breaks into male-dominated sector, the paper on Uganda. And in the case of Benin, we find also some surprising finding for these women who engage in this diversification of portfolios, and they are disproportionately without a partner, most of them. So can you tell us a little bit, let's start with the crossover paper. Can you just give us a flavor of your main findings?
Sure. So the study that a group of us did was, we were doing an impact evaluation of a small-scale industries project in Kampala, in Uganda. And we noticed among the 800 small enterprises we were working with, there were 30 plus women who were in male-dominated sectors. So these were women who were in foundry, they were doing electrical work, metal work, shoemaking. And so the question was, you know, because as your work and a lot of other people's work has shown, a big chunk of the earnings gap between male and female entrepreneurs is due to the sector that you're in. And so the question was, how did these women get there? And so we went out, and this, you know, ended up being a qualitative exercise. And I think what we found, it surprised me a lot. And you know, it wasn't the things I thought it was going to be. It wasn't capital. It wasn't skills. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't some metric of business orientation. What it was, first of all, information. So there's a lot of women who are in these female-dominated sectors who think they make as much as the men, and they're wrong, right? So there's some of them are right because they overlap, but some of them are wrong. So the first step is information. Then the second step is about role models and mentoring, right? So the women who were these crossovers were more likely to have had a male role model in youth, and then they had this active mentoring. They had somebody who introduced them to the profession, helped them, and it was usually a man, but not always, helped them get into it and obviously succeed, because these women are making as much as the men in those sectors. Where there was a reinforcement of traditional norms was coming out of teachers and mothers. Women who were influenced by their teachers and mothers in this sample were much more likely to be in the female-dominated sectors.
Actually, on this, I have a question from my son.
I have a question from my daughter.
So a few months back, my then 7-year-old son at the dinner table said something like, you know, Mom, plastic is a man-made and women-made material. And this made me laugh, of course. And he was very upset, and he said, why are you laughing? Don't you think it's insulting to suggest that women can't make plastic? So I hope he didn't go to school saying, my mom is so gender insensitive. But anyway, so the question for my son is, you know, we always say culture is hard to change. How, you know, there are people that find it insulting that women can't make plastic. So your paper that is about women making plastic is telling us that it's very important, the perception, the information, the environment, the role models. But we always think this is a very hard thing to change. Can the policy affect it to the point that, you know, a 7-year-old can think, well, that doesn't matter?
So I can't answer that definitively. I think we still have yet to see. There are programs that are threatening to try the things that we found, but it hasn't yet been, we don't have any rigorous evidence. There's one piece of evidence which helped motivate us in the study, which was impact evaluation from Kenya, from a vocational training program. And I haven't seen the final results, but the initial thing they did was show girls coming into the training program how much auto mechanics made. And that doubled from a whopping 4% to 9%. The number, doubling. It's all about how you present the results. It doubled the fraction of girls who enrolled in the auto mechanics course. Now, some of the early qualitative feedback was that they were dropping out more, which could be this mentoring bit that we found later. I don't know. And that's one I look forward to. So information, I think, is a good start, but I do think we need more active follow-up.
Okay, so Oriana, you also reviewed other programs in your paper. So can you tell us a little bit, especially what you find surprising? You looked at training programs, training only, cash, microfinance. Clearly, you know, a lot of us were kind of like, I wouldn't say surprised, but actually the results on microfinance have been, pretty tough on this type of program. So can you just tell us a few things about what you reviewed that you find particularly interesting?
Yes, so very quickly, a little bit about microfinance. We already spoke in the previous panel, and the studies that we review confirm that microfinance is effective for some enterprises. These are the enterprises which are at the cusp of making an investment, and they need just a little tiny bit more. For all the other enterprises, it's not very effective because the loans, well, it's called microfinance for a reason. The loans are very small and they have to be repaid very, very soon. So there's actually a very recent study by Erika Field and colleagues where in India they experiment with a different microfinance product where they expand the grace period. So instead of having a 2-week repayment, they have a 2-month repayment. And this has dramatic effects on the people who apply for the loan and for the type of investments that they undertake. This is a randomized controlled trial in India. And they find that this grace period makes a big difference for giving access to poorer people to actually be able to exploit successfully the microfinance. But of course, the dark side is that it attracts more risky investment, and risky investment by definition is more likely to fail. So this microloan with a long grace period doesn't have the very attractive feature of microfinance, which is very high repayment rate. The repayment rate were lower, and actually they calibrate and they find out that probably wouldn't be profitable for the investors. So there is always a trade-off in that sense. The training programs that we review are different from the ones that Petra Todd reviewed earlier because they're not for people outside the labor force. These are for existing micro-entrepreneurs. And the results there are also quite disappointing. Again, in hindsight, it's not too surprising. Most of these training programs are very short. So, you know, how much can you learn in a 2-month program where you go there once a week and perhaps you miss half of the section because you have a business to run. So it's not, I mean, on the one hand, it's good to review and it's good that all this evidence is coming up. And the general message, both from the microfinance and the training program, is that spending little for people who are very poor and need a lot is not effective. It's basically, in many cases, completely ineffective.
Marcus, let's come to your other paper. You also have another interesting paper on crops diversification. Some of these results are pretty interesting and challenge a little bit what we are traditionally thinking about, you know, women specializing in subsistence agriculture, in food production, and men in cash crops. So can you summarize a little bit your main findings there and also indicate some of the policy implication of your paper that might be, you know, complex to some extent?
No, I mean, it's a particularly complicated paper because I think we started with this notion that, well, the stereotype that you hear a lot that women grow the food crops, men grow the cash crops. And in Benin, that's not so much true. right? And then there's the question of what's a cash crop. Tomatoes, which are profitable and are sold, but not exported. Women do a lot of tomatoes. So I think you start to get into this question of what's what. I mean, what we did find, and I think here I'm going to speak to a more broader program of work as well, is that on a given hectare, a woman in Africa, you know, now we have evidence from 3 national studies, will produce less than a man, right? And this is because she doesn't have the inputs that he does, the quantity of the inputs, but she's also getting less out of those inputs. So I think with, perhaps in a bit of a contrast to the private sector work, I think the agriculture is more about securing ways to get women, well, to secure their property rights so they have some land to farm. That's sort of step one, and that seems to be a big block. And then securing their access to inputs and their control over inputs. So I think agriculture is sort of, the problems are, to put it bluntly, more basic. And it's about the control of the resources really at a basic level, starting with land.
Oriana, one thing that it's a bit uncommon about your paper is that you report some cost-benefit analysis in your paper. I mean, actually, it's not that common to find this type of information, especially, I mean, in this case, the question is, a lot of these interventions are very expensive. So how do the cost and the benefit, which direction, or how cost-effective are these interventions?
Yeah. So there's probably a reason why these cost-benefit analyses are not very common, which is because they're quite difficult, because it requires making a whole lot of assumption about what would have happened, what if we had done this instead of that. So a very simple way of doing it is to just see the effect on yearly earnings and compare that to the cost of the program. And if you compare, the cost of the program was about $300 per household in 2007. And the increase in earnings was such that in 11 years, you would have recovered the cost. But that's probably not the most informative comparison, because the real question that you want to address is, what else could we have done with $300? If we spend $300 per household, is it really the best thing to do to give these people a cow and 2 years' worth of training? Or could we do something else? Then perhaps the most logical something else to compare it to is cash. What would happen if these people had cash? Well, we can't really answer that as rigorously as we evaluated the program, because we don't have an intervention in which we offer people the choice of taking cash instead. We are actually in the process of implementing this, but we don't have the results yet. And so we need to speculate on what they would do with the cash if they had it. And here it's very difficult, because there are results suggesting that women have faced a lot of pressure to share once they receive a large amount of cash, to share with their extended family or the social network. But assume that they manage to keep it and invest it and put it into a savings account. So formal savings accounts in rural Bangladesh are non-existent, but there are NGOs and microfinance institutions that take savings, and the returns for those savings are about 4.5%, whereas the return that we estimate for the program is 7%. So if you just compare, assuming that the alternative use of cash would be to put it in the bank, in this case in the microfinance institution, this would be better than giving cash. But these are average values. There is a very important twist, which is that when we allow the effects to be heterogeneous across the population of treated women, we find that some women benefit enormously, way more than the average. But a lot benefit just at the average of construction lower. And so for all those people, which is 60% of the treated women, actually the cash would have been better. It would have been better to get $300 in cash, assuming that you can keep it and put it in an account, would have yielded more than what the program yields. But for the remaining 40%, the program seems to be better than this cash alternative.
I have a question for the two of you. Myra, in the introduction, mentioned that we are interested in looking at the effectiveness of these programs, but also for whom and where. So one interesting finding, for example, for rural women is that a lot of those are widows, sole earners, etc. So the question is, how do we explain these findings? Are these programs, especially successful for these women because they are in this special category of women that have to go out? I mean, is it something about them in particular? Is it that they are in some kinds of training? I was also wondering sometimes it's not under the influence of the husband, in a sense that they have to provide for themselves and they can't provide for themselves. Or are there other explanations of why this happens?
Well, being the sole earner of the household is hardly an exogenous event. So it's very difficult to compare the effectiveness of these programs for women sole earners to women who have husbands, because there's a host of other factors that come into the picture, other than the basic incentive needs to, you have more need to work if you're the sole earner, by definition. This was a question that was raised earlier, that in many societies, cultural norms are such that if a woman is married, she shouldn't be working, or at least not working outside the household. And so if that's the case, the programs have to be tailored and made in a way that the husband can participate and there is buy-in from the husband. The other way is to actually target women before they get married. So all the adolescent training programs that improve the labor market opportunities for girls, who then will only enter a marriage with a man who accepts them working. If you improve the outside opportunity, then it's easier for men to accept upon marriage rather than an existing married couple where the woman has been subjugated for the past 20 years and all of a sudden she becomes earning more than her husband. So we have observed this process of transformation in the US and European countries in the last century. I mean, we shouldn't forget that 100 years ago, it wasn't common for women to work in this country. And there has been a massive cultural shift. There is some work by Raquel Fernandez of New York University that documents the role of culture in determining these work norms, and how the positive aspect of this is how norms evolve very quickly in the space of a generation, and how men whose mom is working are more accepting of their wives working. So all it takes is one generation of women, well, perhaps more than that to cover the entire population, but already one generation of women who participate in the labor force can make quite a difference through this intergenerational transmission of norms.
Yeah, so what's your take, Marcus, also on the young women in particular?
No, I would agree with what Oriana was saying about the young. I mean, we have this work that we've done together with an adolescent program in Uganda, also run by BRAC, which shows really striking impacts, not only on the income, but also on their sort of ability to, they're less likely to have kids, and they're much less likely to have sex against their will. So sort of the things we would think of as empowerment, which you sort of catching that norm at that age, and then hopefully, we don't know, but hopefully that leads into a generational shift as they get older. But coming back to the women's, it basically comes down to ability to exercise control. Right? So if you look at David McKinsey's results in Sri Lanka, where he found that giving these capital to female entrepreneurs had no impact, part of the story there was they invested in things their husband couldn't expropriate. Right? So it's a bit of, this comes back to what you're saying, right? Which is the women who are the heads of the households got there because they're forceful enough and could resist whatever was going to push them into another household. But then the women in a marriage, there's a question of how you, and I think this is a thing that we still have to deal with our programs, which is how you make sure that the women retain control over what's ever transferred, whether it's in kind or in cash.
Thank you. So I think we need to wrap up. They tell me there is a time for a question for the audience. They take 1 or 2. There is one over there.
Hi, thank you. I'm June Zeitlin with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. I'm a lawyer, not an economist, but it seems like both in this panel and the panel before, Some of your research is really challenging some conventional assumptions about what works for women's employment, and certainly within the donor community as well as maybe other institutions. And so I'm just wondering, and maybe this is also a question for Kathy and Myra, how kind of you can take it out of just the research outcomes and come up with, here are some unconventional findings or things you might want to think about in developing programs in the future, like microcredit is not the answer, or you need to look at who controls the decision-making or who owns the land. You can't just develop a training program, things that, aren't maybe so fashionable in the donor community. So I'm just wondering to what extent you think that the research really leads you in some new directions.
I don't see any other one. I see one. So let's take another one over there. So we answer the two together.
Sure. Hi, British Robinson with Women for Women International. I'm just curious if any of your research or if you found any other studies that showed if you couple together life skills training or social skills training with business and entrepreneurship training that you had greater impact. Thanks.
Okay, so why don't we answer these two? Probably, Oriana, you had something on the life skill.
Yes, so actually the program that Marcus was referring to, the Empowering Adolescent Girls, which is run by BRAC in a number of African countries, offers both life skill training and income generating training. We are talking about randomizing the two components to be able to identify the power of the interaction of the two. But it's always, it's a big challenge of evaluation where, from the point of view of researchers, you really want to unpack all the mechanism and understand which of these is really working, whereas the NGO is convinced that they have the answer and they only work when they're together. And so they're less willing to randomize the two. But once, I think now there is a lot of attention in these programs, and once they know that actually the program does work, there is more interest in finding out exactly why it works and if it can be run more effectively by decoupling the components. So the answer in short is, it's a very good question. I wish I had the answer, and I think we'll probably have it in a couple of years with a bit of luck.
What about the first one, which is probably a little bit also about context and how the various pieces come together?
No, I mean, I think the one good thing about, one of the good things about working at the World Bank is that I get to interact with policymakers a lot. And, what makes me happy is that a lot of them are willing to try new things. I mean, for sure, there's a path dependence in how donors work, and they're going to do the same thing yesterday they did today. Or, yeah, they go back in time, too. But I think, look, they're intrigued by this, particularly when you can show them the evidence of what the payoffs are, right? So if you do this ultra poor program, there's a clear payoff there, and there's a significant number of them who care, and they will try that. So I'm not trying to be naive about it, but there's an openness to evidence when you bring it, and people try it. So the results I was talking about earlier about the crossing over, it's kind of scary, I think, for people who do your average private sector program. But we had a colleague who was like, oh yeah, I'm going to try this in 2 or 3 places. And so, obviously you should do it very carefully, but there's an openness to trying these new things, I think, and learning from them as they go.
Okay, I think with this we have to close here. So join me in thanking the panelists.